The inheritance. Marcus considered the precise dating of medieval agricultural tools far more compelling than any contemporary social interaction. His days, meticulously structured, revolved around dusty archives and the quiet hum of his own research. Solitude was not a consequence of his work. It was a prerequisite, a preferred state. His small, precisely ordered apartment, filled with stacks of monographs and annotated maps, served as a fortress against the chaotic intrusions of the outside world. He valued empirical evidence, the tangible weight of historical record, and possessed a deep, ingrained skepticism toward anything that defied rational explanation. Legends were fascinating, yes, but only as anthropological curiosities, echoes of a less enlightened past. The solicitor's letter arrived on a Tuesday, disturbing the rhythmic peace of his morning. It was an anomaly, a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing an unfamiliar crest, interrupting the usual flow of academic journals and utility bills. He slit the seal with the edge of a bronze letter opener, a relic he'd acquired from a forgotten antiquarian shop, feeling a flicker of annoyance at the interruption. The contents were brief, formal, and startlingly direct. He was the sole heir to Blackwood Manor. Marcus stared at the name. Blackwood Manor. The name itself was a whisper of local folklore, a place he'd vaguely catalogued in his mental inventory of regional superstitions. A place associated with unexplained occurrences and unfortunate residents, the kind of local color historians occasionally noted but never seriously considered. The letter detailed the passing of a distant, largely unknown relative, a great-aunt, apparently, and the immediate transfer of property. There was a specific clause, highlighted, demanding his physical presence for the formal acceptance of the inheritance within a month. Failure to comply would result in the forfeiture of the estate to a charitable trust. A mild obligation, nothing more. He felt no grief, only a detached curiosity, a faint intellectual prickling at the unexpected disruption. He spent the next few days in the university library, not researching his current project, but cross-referencing regional histories and gazetteers. It sat in a remote, forgotten corner of the county, nestled deep within a sprawling, ancient forest. The local records were sparse, often couched in euphemism, difficult to maintain, unsuited for modern habitation, a place of ill repute. He found a few sensationalist articles from the late 19th century, detailing disappearances and isolated incidents of madness attributed to the manor's malign influence. Marcus scoffed. Superstitious nonsense, the product of rural isolation and overactive imaginations. He'd seen far worse attributed to faulty wiring or poor sanitation. Still, the consistency of the narrative, however irrational, was mildly intriguing. The journey itself was a descent into increasing isolation. Marcus drove his sensible, well-maintained sedan through winding country roads that gradually narrowed, shedding asphalt for gravel. Then, for little more than packed earth, the rolling hills of cultivated farmland gave way to dense, unbroken forest. The trees growing taller, their branches intertwining overhead to form a perpetual twilight. The air grew cooler, carrying the damp scent of loam and decaying leaves. The chirping of birds faded, replaced by a profound, almost unnatural silence. He reached a border checkpoint, a ramshackle wooden hut manned by a solitary, taciturn official. The structure looked as though it had been erected decades ago and forgotten, its paint peeling, its windows opaque with grime. The official, a man with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to hold a vast, unspoken weariness, examined Marcus's identification with an unhurried thoroughness that bordered on suspicion. He asked the purpose of Marcus's visit, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. Inheritance, Marcus stated, keeping his tone neutral. Blackwood Manor. The official's eyes, previously dull, sharpened. He held Marcus's license for a moment longer than necessary, then slowly returned it. A subtle shift occurred in his posture, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. That's a ways up, he said, his gaze lingering on Marcus. Not many go that way anymore. Fewer still come back the same. He offered no further explanation, simply waved Marcus through with his slow, deliberate motion. The implication hung in the still air, a faint, unsettling echo. Marcus dismissed it as typical rural insularity, a local's attempt at dramatic embellishment. Beyond the checkpoint, the road deteriorated further, becoming a mere track swallowed by encroaching undergrowth. The trees here were ancient, gnarled giants, their limbs twisting like arthritic fingers against a perpetually overcast sky. The light grew dimmer, a bruised purple haze filtering through the thick canopy. Marcus felt a subtle pressure behind his ears, a faint ringing that he attributed to the sudden change in altitude or perhaps the unnerving quiet. Then, through a sudden break in the trees, he saw it. It was not merely old. It was ancient, a colossal edifice of blackened stone that seemed to have grown organically from the earth itself. No manicured lawns greeted him, only an overgrown, tangled wilderness that pressed right up against its foundations, clawing at the walls like grasping hands. A long-disused iron gate, rusted solid, stood ajar, its hinges groaning softly in a non-existent breeze. A broken sign, almost swallowed by ivy, still bore the faded, illegible script of its name. The manor loomed, vast and unyielding, a monument to forgotten time. A historian, after all, was trained to appreciate the weight of the past. But this felt different. He stepped out of the car. The air smelled of damp stone, decaying wood, and something else, something metallic and faintly bitter, like old blood and rust. He reached for it, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second. He rapped sharply. There was no bell. No answer. He pushed. Marcus stood on the threshold, a determined skeptic confronting a legend, feeling the immense, silent weight of Blackwood Manor settle upon him. He stepped inside, the heavy door swinging shut behind him with a resonant thud that vibrated through the stone floor and into his very bones. He was alone, and the manor felt impossibly vast, impossibly quiet, as if holding its breath. The official at the border checkpoint had offered no further words, only a protracted stare that Marcus had met with a practiced, neutral expression. The exchange had been brief, yet the lingering impression of the man's sharpened gaze persisted as Marcus navigated the winding, unkempt road. The official was a local, perhaps accustomed to quiet, and Marcus's arrival was likely a disruption. Nothing more. The road, initially paved and pocked with neglect, eventually dissolved into a gravel track, then little more than a pair of muddy ruts swallowed by encroaching undergrowth. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Towering, skeletal trees clawed at the overcast sky, their branches forming a grotesque canopy that filtered the light into a perpetual twilight. The silence here was profound, broken only by the crunch of tires and the distant, mournful cry of an unseen bird. Marcus felt the familiar prickle of anticipation, not fear, but the thrill of discovery that always accompanied his pursuit of history. Finally, the track opened onto a clearing, revealing the manor. It was immense, a sprawling stone edifice that seemed to have grown organically from the very land. Turrets of uneven height pierced the sky, their slate roofs crumbling in places. Windows, dark and unreflecting, stared out like vacant eyes. A heavy oak door studded with rusted iron sagged slightly on its hinges. The manor exuded an aura of profound age, a testament to centuries of forgotten lives. Marcus, a connoisseur of ancient architecture, felt a surge of professional admiration. Local superstitions were precisely that, local and superstitious. He retrieved a heavy-duty flashlight and a crowbar, practical tools for a practical man exploring a derelict structure. The main door groaned open with a sound like a tortured beast, revealing a cavernous interior choked with dust and the unmistakable odor of advanced decay. Mildew, damp stone, and something else, something subtly metallic, like old blood, or perhaps just rust. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating vast, empty rooms draped in cobwebs, their once grand furnishings shrouded under thick sheets of white dust. He found a relatively intact study on the ground floor, its large mahogany desk and built-in bookshelves still standing, albeit caked in grime. This would serve as his temporary base of operations. Over the next 2 days, Marcus worked with methodical efficiency, transforming the dusty study into a functional research space. He hauled in crates of books, microfiche readers, and his laptop, connecting a portable satellite internet system. Each book, each document, was carefully catalogued and organized according to his meticulous system. He wiped down surfaces, swept away centuries of debris, and even managed to pry open a few stubborn windows to air out the stagnant atmosphere. It was during this initial phase of settling in that the subtle discrepancies began. He would place a heavy tome on the left side of his desk, certain of its position, only to find it later shifted slightly to the right, or even on a lower shelf. He attributed this to his own fatigue, his mind preoccupied with the vast scope of his historical undertaking. Absent-mindedness, he muttered, repositioning a leather-bound volume on medieval land tenure. Patches of air, intensely frigid, would appear seemingly at random, lingering for a few moments before dissipating. He felt them mostly in the hallways near the grand staircase, and occasionally within the study itself. Marcus, ever the rationalist, deduced drafts. The manor was old, poorly sealed, and the autumn winds, no matter how faint outside, could easily funnel through unseen cracks in ancient vents. He made a mental note to investigate the structural integrity of the window frames and wall linings. Faint, indistinct murmurs, like a hushed conversation just beyond the threshold of hearing. They drifted through the heavy air, particularly at dusk when the manor truly began to settle into its own profound quiet. He would pause, straining his ears, but the sounds would always recede, leaving only the creaks and groans of an ancient house. The house was a living thing, he told himself, settling, expanding, contracting. Old wood, old stone, old pipes. His mind, accustomed to the bustle of academic libraries, was simply over-interpreting ambient noise. He was meticulously arranging a stack of local historical records, yellowed parchments detailing property transfers and family lineages, when his hand brushed against a loose panel in the back of the mahogany desk. It gave way with a faint click, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment. Inside lay a small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth, and a bundle of letters tied with a faded velvet ribbon. The paper was brittle, the ink faint, but the handwriting was elegant, looping script. Marcus carefully extracted the journal. Its pages crackled with age. The first few entries detailed mundane daily life, observations on weather, garden yields, and local gossip. But as he turned the pages, the tone shifted. The script grew more erratic. The sentences fragmented, it deepens. Not of the season, but from within they shift. Civil. One cannot trust the angles. Always in the periphery. Accusations and treaties Marcus cannot discern. My mind fragments. Marcus frowned. A previous inhabitant, clearly suffering from some form of mental deterioration. He turned to the letters. They were addressed to a dearest Eleanor and signed your devoted but tormented Alistair. The content echoed the journal's growing despair. The house demands. It drinks, not wine, nor water, but something far more precious. Marcus, feel it draining me. Eleanor, my memories blur. It was a Tuesday or Wednesday. Did Marcus write this yesterday or a month past? The voices speak of a hunger, an ancient, insatiable hunger. They tempt me with visions, reflections of what once was, what could be. But the price is too high. Marcus closed the journal, placing it carefully beside the letters. Melodramatic. Perhaps a reclusive artist, or a scholar driven to the brink by isolation and a failing constitution. He had encountered similar historical documents before, testaments to lives lived on the fringes of sanity. He felt a detached professional curiosity, a desire to contextualize Alistair's decline within the manor's known history. But as he looked around the silent, dust-laden study, a faint metallic tang seemed to prickle the back of his throat. He shook his head. Just the smell of old paper. He needed to get some fresh air. Marcus closed the journal, placing it carefully beside the letters. The previous occupant, an artist named Alistair Finch, had clearly been prone to dramatic introspection, a common trait among creatives struggling with isolation. Marcus, a historian, dealt in facts and patterns in the verifiable. Emotions, particularly overwrought ones, were secondary data, contextual, rarely definitive. The manor, however, seemed determined to challenge his empirical resolve. The following days brought a subtle shift in its atmospheric pressure. He would be engrossed in a century-old ledger tracing property transfers when a faint, almost imperceptible whisper would brush against his auditory perception. It was never distinct enough to form words, merely a breathy exhalation, a sibilant sigh that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the walls. He would pause, tilt his head, and listen intently, but the sound would vanish, leaving only the familiar groan of ancient timbers settling with a faint whistle of a draft under a ill-fitting window frame. He rationalized it as the acoustics of the vast, empty rooms, amplifying the mundane sounds of the decaying structure. Then came the shadows, a momentary deepening of the gloom in a corner, a flicker of movement by the library door. He would snap his gaze towards it, but the space would be empty, bathed in the consistent, if dim, light of his reading lamp. Eye strain, he concluded, a consequence of poring over brittle, yellow documents for hours on end. He adjusted his spectacles, rubbed his temples, and dismissed the visual anomalies with a practiced, academic detachment. His sleep, however, proved less amenable to rationalization. The nights grew long, heavy, with a suffocating stillness that even the rustling wind outside failed to penetrate. He began to experience vivid, unsettling nightmares. They were not explicit horrors, but rather abstract anxieties, a sense of being perpetually observed, of losing vital parts of himself, of wandering through endless, identical corridors that twisted back on themselves. He would wake abruptly, gasping for air, the phantom weight of unseen eyes lingering on his skin, the taste of dust and forgotten ages clinging to his tongue. The disorientation was profound, the line between dream and wakefulness blurring in the pre-dawn gloom. He found himself checking the locks on doors that had no practical reason to be secured, a small, irrational ritual he performed before forcing himself back into a restless slumber, driven by a nascent, unwelcome curiosity or perhaps a growing compulsion. Marcus intensified his research into the manor's past inhabitants. The local archives were sparse, but the internet provided a surprising wealth of digitized historical newspapers and property records. He cross-referenced names, dates, and local accounts, slowly piecing together a grim tableau. After the initial owner, a prosperous merchant, the manor had passed through several hands. Each subsequent resident, particularly those who had lived there in prolonged isolation, seemed to follow a similar trajectory. There were newspaper clippings detailing the unfortunate demise of a reclusive botanist who had succumbed to a melancholic temperament and was found drowned in the estate's pond. A verdict Marcus now read as thinly veiled suicide. Another, a wealthy spinster, was reported missing, her disappearance attributed to wandering off in a confused state, though no trace of her was ever found. A brief, almost clinical report mentioned a family of 4 who had simply vanished in the 1890s. The manor found empty save for a single, half-eaten meal on the dining table. The local constable at the time had noted no signs of forced entry, merely an inexplicable absence. Marcus's fingers trembled slightly as he scrolled through a digitized court record from the early 20th century. It detailed a petition filed by the distant relatives of a scholar named Elias Thorne, seeking to declare him legally deceased after he had become unreachable and unresponsive within the manor for over 2 years. The petition included a fragmented, almost incoherent letter from Thorne himself, dated months before his official disappearance. It was a physical weight, pressing me down. I could not speak. I could not move. I turned back. The clinical detachment he so prided himself on was beginning to fray. Madness. Disappearance. Suicide. A disturbing trifecta, repeated with unnerving regularity. The house, not merely a repository of history, but a protagonist in a recurring tragedy. They were the opening movements of an insidious symphony, a prelude to the fate that had befallen all who had come before him. A new terrifying hypothesis began to form in the quiet, dust-filled air of the study. This was not a place that merely witnessed history, it consumed it and him. The cold prickle Marcus had felt earlier had not dissipated. Instead, it had intensified, a persistent, icy thread woven into the fabric of his awareness. The clinical detachment he so valued, the intellectual distance he maintained from his subjects, was fraying at the edges. He attempted to re-establish control, reminding himself of the logical fallacies inherent in attributing sentience to architecture. Old houses settled, timbers creaked, drafts whistled. These were empirical facts, not harbingers of malevolence. Yet, the silence of the manor felt different now. It was no longer merely quiet. It was expectant, heavy, as if the air itself held its breath. He moved through the library, his hand brushing against the spine of a leather-bound volume. He retracted his hand, examining it as if it might bear some visible mark. Nazo, he exhaled slowly, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The intricate loops of thread blurred, then sharpened, and for a fleeting instant, the stag's eyes seemed to track his movement. He spun around, his gaze sweeping the ornate room. But the incidents grew more frequent, more insistent. A faint, acrid smell, like old, dried blood, would bloom and vanish in the study. He began to feel an intense, unseen presence, a constant pressure as if he were perpetually under observation. He started speaking aloud, narrating his actions, his thoughts, a desperate attempt to anchor himself in the present, to prove his own singular existence. I am Marcus. The air grew dense, humid, carrying the faint scent of wilting roses. He blinked, and the parchment in his hand seemed to shimmer. The sturdy oak desk beneath his forearms felt suddenly rough, splintered, as if decades of varnish had peeled away. He looked up, his gaze drawn to the window. Outside, the familiar landscape of overgrown gardens was gone. Instead, a driving rain lashed against ancient, leaded panes. Indistinct but clearly female stood by the window, her back to him, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The heavy silk of her gown rustled as she moved, a low, mournful sound. He tried to speak, but his throat was tight, constricted. The image held, utterly solid, utterly real for perhaps 10 seconds. Then, as abruptly as it had appeared, it dissolved. The study was back, the familiar rain pattering softly against the modern glass, the scent of dust and old paper reasserting itself. Marcus leaned back, his chair scraping loudly on the floorboards. His breath hitched. His carefully constructed skepticism, a fortress of reason and empirical data, began to fracture. This was not a hallucination born of fatigue. This was too vivid, too immersive. He felt the phantom ache of a stranger's sorrow in his chest, the lingering scent of long-dead roses on his tongue. He spent the rest of the night poring over the manor's archives, desperately searching for an explanation, for a rational hook to cling to. The article recounted her apprehension at a distant border checkpoint, her subsequent return to the manor, and her rapid decline into a state of profound melancholy. The words seemed to vibrate on the page, the ink bleeding into a deeper crimson. The house didn't just hold memories, it replayed them, forced them upon its inhabitants. It was a prison, the walls themselves extensions of an invisible boundary. He felt eyes on him, not merely the phantom gaze of a historical figure, but something more primal, more ancient. It was the manor itself, watching, assessing. He was not merely an observer of history, he was becoming a part of it, another entry in the manor's grim ledger. The lines between past and present, between his own identity and the echoes of those who had suffered within these walls, were blurring into a terrifying, indistinguishable haze. He was being absorbed, slowly, meticulously. The parchment in Marcus's hand did not merely shift, it seemed to breathe. The air, heavy with the humid sweetness of wilting roses, pressed in, thick and cloying. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, the sensation dissolving as quickly as it had arrived, leaving only the memory of an impossible movement and a lingering, faint botanical decay. Yet, the distinct scent of decaying petals persisted, clinging to his clothes, his hair, even the very pages of Aliner's meticulously kept journals. Days blurred into a single, extended study. Marcus found himself hunched over the mahogany desk for hours, the old records splayed before him. He attempted to call his research contact, a colleague who had promised further historical documents. The landline emitted only a flat, unwavering hum. His mobile phone displayed no service, a common occurrence in such a remote location, but the signal had been sporadic, not utterly absent until now. He tried again and again, the cold plastic growing warm in his grip as he dialed the same number, only to be met with the sterile silence of an unconnected line. Emails remained in his outbox, perpetually sending, their status bar frozen at a fraction of completion. A dull ache began behind his eyes, a persistent thrumming that matched the silence of his defunct communications. A week later, the stale air of the manor felt like a second skin. He had not stepped outside since the incident with the parchment. The thought of the outside world, with its sharp edges and indifferent noises, had begun to feel strangely alien. The growing sense of isolation, however, eventually spurred him to action. This was illogical. This was unhealthy. He packed a small bag, a change of clothes, his wallet. As he descended the main staircase, the floorboards groaned beneath his weight, a deep, resonant sigh that seemed to echo his own reluctance. The winding lane, bordered by ancient, gnarled trees, seemed longer than he remembered. The canopy overhead formed a perpetual twilight even at midday. A profound lethargy began to creep into his limbs, a leaden weight that pressed down on his shoulders, making the simple act of steering an effort. He pressed on. He had to. In the distance, a low, utilitarian building materialized, flanked by a raised barrier and a small, empty booth. This was the border checkpoint, the only route connecting his isolated region to the broader world beyond. As he approached, the scene struck him as unusually quiet. No vehicles waited, no personnel were visible. The barrier was raised, inexplicably, inviting passage. Marcus slowed the car, a tremor running through his hands. The air here was different, thin and sharp, carrying the faint tang of exhaust, fumes, and distant, barren earth. He stopped just before the barrier, his engine idling, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the cooling metal. He looked towards the booth. A single, tattered flag, its colors faded to indistinguishable hues, drooped from a pole. There was no sign of life, no official, no movement. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He could simply drive through. The barrier was up, yet he couldn't. An invisible wall seemed to solidify before him, not physical, but psychological. The outside world, represented by this deserted, silent checkpoint, felt vast and terrifying. It offered nothing but exposure, raw and unprotected. The manor, by contrast, was a shell, a refuge, however unsettling. He felt the familiar, heavy blanket of the house's presence settle over him again, a comforting weight that promised an end to this acute vulnerability. With a defeated sigh, Marcus turned the steering wheel, executing a tight, three-point turn. The tires crunched on the gravel, the sound echoing in the unnatural quiet. He drove back the way he had come, the desolate checkpoint receding in his rearview mirror. A strange sense of relief washed over him, a perverse comfort in relinquishing the fight. The house was waiting. It was always waiting. Back within the manor walls, a profound lassitude claimed him. He no longer bothered with regular meals, subsisting on whatever dry provisions remained. His beard grew unruly, his clothes rumpled and stained. He rarely left the study now, the historical documents a flimsy shield against the encroaching reality. The manor, he understood, did not merely contain him. It held him. It was a possessive entity, its tendrils reaching into his will, slowly, subtly, reshaping his desires. Marcus blinked, rubbing at his eyes, the faint sweetness of wilting roses in the air growing more insistent, cloying. The parchment, a brittle sheet of ancient history, felt smooth and inert beneath his fingertips now. A mute object. Had he truly seen it undulate? A trick of the flickering lamplight, perhaps, or the strain of deciphering the cramped script. He dismissed the notion, though a residue of unease lingered, a faint chill that had nothing to do with the manor's inherent dampness. He pushed the document aside, the archival work suddenly feeling futile. His head throbbed, a dull ache behind his temples. Lately, the house had felt less like a static structure and more like a fluid entity, its angles subtly shifting, its dimensions stretching. He attributed it to fatigue, to the sheer overwhelming weight of the past he was trying to excavate. Rising from a heavy oak desk, Marcus found his steps unusually unsteady. The floorboards, familiar in their creaks and groans, seemed to vibrate with a low hum he hadn't noticed before. He walked, intending to reach the grand staircase, but the corridor appeared to lengthen, the portraits on the walls, stern, unfamiliar faces, seeming to track his progress with an unnerving intensity. He paused, looking at a particular portrait, a man with a severe gaze and a high, starched collar. He touched his own throat, an instinctive gesture, as if checking for a similar collar. The thought was disquieting. He turned a corner he knew led to the drawing room, but instead found himself facing a long, unlit passage, one he could not recall ever having seen. This wasn't right. He knew this house had walked every inch of its documented layout. A sudden, jarring image flashed through his mind. A wooden barrier, painted with bold, stark stripes, and a stern-faced guard in a heavy coat. He was standing in a barren, windswept landscape, the only sound the flapping of a tattered flag. He panicked, searching his pockets, but his hands were empty. Then, as abruptly as it arrived, the vision dissolved. Marcus stood in the stone passage, his heart hammering against his ribs, sweat beating on his forehead. The metallic tang was still there, but the frigid wind was gone, replaced by the manor's stagnant air. He shook his head, pressing his palms against his eyes. What was that? A hallucination? A dream intruding upon waking? The memory of the border checkpoint was so vivid, so utterly real, yet it had no place here, no context in his life. He was Marcus, a historian, in his inherited manor. He was not a refugee, not a traveler seeking passage. The details were fuzzy, elusive. He remembered fragments, a discussion about Baroque architecture, the taste of lukewarm tea, the scratch of his pen on paper. But when had these things happened? Yesterday? A week ago? His sense of chronology was unraveling. This stone passage stretched before him, beckoning. He felt compelled to explore it, as if the house itself were guiding him. This was not in any of the blueprints, not in any of the historical records. It was new, or perhaps revealed. A wave of dizziness washed over him. As his vision cleared, he noticed something etched into the pillar's surface, a crude, almost frantic inscription. He traced the lines with a trembling finger. Who am I? Where is my home? Below it, another, fainter etching. They say I am Elias, but I remember a different name. Elias. He knew that name. Elias Thorne, a former resident, one of the many whose lives had ended strangely within these walls. The words resonated with a terrifying familiarity, a creeping echo in his own mind. But what was his name again? The clarity he just had, the certainty of being Marcus, a historian, flickered, wavered. The name, Elias, clung to Marcus's thoughts like a persistent, cold residue. It was not merely a recognition. It was a resonance, a vibration deep within him, as if a tuning fork had struck a sympathetic chord in his very core. The room, with its familiar dust motes dancing in the weak afternoon light, began to waver. The antique furniture seemed to breathe, its dark wood expanding and contracting with an imperceptible rhythm. His fingers pressed against the rough, flaking plaster of the wall beside him, but the texture felt alien, shifting beneath his touch as if it were not plaster at all, but something organic, fibrous. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing the sensation away, but the pressure behind his eyelids intensified, morphing into a vivid, disorienting kaleidoscope of images. When he opened them again, the study was gone. He stood on cracked asphalt, a biting wind whipping at his clothes. The sky above was an unforgiving gray, heavy with impending snow. Ahead, a low, concrete structure spanned the road, topped with observation booths where figures in heavy uniforms moved with methodical, unhurried purpose. Barbed wire snaked along the perimeter, glinting dully. This was a border checkpoint. Confusion, sharp and immediate, pierced through the lingering haze. What? His fingers closed around nothing. A uniformed guard, face obscured by the shadow of his cap, approached him. The guard's boots crunched on the frozen gravel. Papers, sir. The voice was flat, devoid of inflection. Marcus tried to speak, but his throat felt constricted, dry. He could only manage a choked sound. The guard's gaze was unnervingly steady, dissecting, as if peering into the very marrow of his bones. Purpose of travel? The guard pressed, his voice a low rumble. Purpose? He had no purpose here. He had no memory of travel, no destination, no reason. Marcus, historian, Blackwood Manor. The words felt distant, like echoes from someone else's life. He was Marcus, wasn't he? But the conviction was weak, dissolving like mist. The guard leaned closer, his eyes, barely visible beneath the brim, seemed to bore into him. You appear disoriented. Are you unwell? There was no sympathy in the question, only a clinical assessment. Your records are incomplete. Your passage is irregular. Irregular. The word resonated with an unsettling truth. He felt irregular. He felt fragmented. He felt consumed. A profound sense of loss washed over him, not of an object or a person, but of himself. His thoughts, his memories, the very framework of his identity, felt like they were slipping through his fingers, dissolving into the biting wind. The guard's face seemed to ripple. The concrete structure behind him wavered, and the barbed wire began to stretch, elongating into impossibly thin filaments that hummed with a low, predatory thrum. The biting wind dissolved into the stale, cloying air of the study. Marcus gasped, stumbling back against the heavy desk, his heart hammering against his ribs. Not with panic, but with a terrifying, icy clarity. He was still in the study. He had never left. The border checkpoint, the guard, the questions, the crushing sense of loss. It had all been a vivid, terrifying illusion. But it was more than an illusion. It had been an experience. He tried to remember a specific detail from his childhood, a particular academic triumph, the face of a distant relative. The memories were there, but faded, like old photographs left too long in the sun, their vibrancy muted, their edges blurred. A profound, sickening realization bloomed in the pit of his stomach. The manor, it wasn't just haunted, it wasn't just influencing his perceptions. It was feeding. The border checkpoint, a place of scrutiny and identity verification, had been a stage for its consumption. It had taken his memories, his sense of self, siphoning them away, leaving him diminished. Elias and all the others, they hadn't just died strangely. They had been meticulously, excruciatingly devoured. The house was not a structure, it was a predator. Its walls were not inert. They were the digestive tract of an ancient, malevolent entity. The dust, the smells, the subtle shifts in light and sound. They were the manifestations of its slow, deliberate metabolism. It thrived on the very essence of its inhabitants, growing stronger, more complex with each life it consumed. And Marcus, the reclusive historian, the skeptic, was its current meal. He was not merely in a house. He was trapped within a living maw, and it was slowly, patiently chewing him to pieces. The manor hummed around him now, a low, resonant purr, a sound of profound satisfaction. He could feel its presence pressing in, a colossal, invisible weight, hungry and ancient, eager for the next course. He was next. The word consumed still echoed in the hollowed spaces of Marcus's mind, a dirge for the self he was rapidly losing. His thoughts, once a meticulously organized library, now resembled scattered pages in a gale. Yet, amidst the chaos, a splinter of defiance ignited. It was a cold, sharp spark, born not of hope, but of a desperate, primal refusal to simply cease. He would not be dissolved. A sudden, jarring clarity pierced the mental fog. He was still Marcus, albeit a frayed and diminished version. He still possessed the will to resist. The house hummed around him, a low, insidious vibration that sought to soothe him into oblivion, to lull his consciousness into a gentle, permanent sleep. He recognized the tactic now. It wanted him quiescent, compliant. But the thought of dissolving, of becoming nothing, tasted like ash on his tongue. He needed a weapon, a shield, anything to sever this parasitic bond. His gaze swept the study, a room he had once considered a sanctuary. The air, usually thick with the scent of aged paper and dust, now carried a faint, metallic tang, like old blood. His hands, trembling slightly, moved to the nearest bookshelf, pulling out volumes with frantic urgency. His historian's instinct, though battered, still functioned. The house fed on memories, on life force. What could counteract such an entity? Something forgotten, perhaps. Something suppressed. The rhythmic creak of floorboards underfoot seemed to mock his haste. He searched not for information about the manor's victims, but for its vulnerability. He remembered an obscure reference, glimpsed weeks ago, to an ancient practice, a binding ritual, but he had dismissed it as folklore, irrelevant to his academic pursuits. Now, its memory shimmered, a tantalizing, elusive thread. He pushed through the heavy oak door leading from the study into the manor's central hall, and a profound disquiet settled over him. The hallway stretched before him, longer than he remembered, the ornate wallpaper blurring into a monotonous pattern of faded roses and twisting vines. Ahead, where the hall typically opened into a wider landing, a sudden, stark alteration manifested. A section of the manor had transformed. His mind reeled, not from confusion, but from the sheer audacity of the manifestation. The house was not merely playing tricks, it was actively constructing obstacles, physicalizing his internal struggle. This checkpoint was designed to halt him, to make him question his advance. It was the house, attempting to drain his resolve, to make him turn back. This was a test. He reached the table, running his fingers over its rough, unvarnished surface. He leaned closer, peering into the inky blackness. He knelt, his fingers brushing against the underside. A small, almost invisible latch. With a grunt, he fumbled with it, and a concealed drawer slid open with a soft groan of aged wood. Inside lay a single object, a small, intricately carved wooden box, no larger than his palm. They were sharp, angular, like shards of ice, yet they seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light. Beside it, a single, brittle parchment, rolled tight and tied with a thread of dried sinew. His hands trembled as he lifted the box. He carefully untied the parchment. It was a diagram, stark and minimalist, showing the manor's foundational layout, but overlaid upon it in a crude, almost violent hand were the same angular symbols etched on the box, and then a series of annotations in a language he recognized as a deeply archaic form of Old English, almost entirely lost to common scholarship. He squinted, his mind racing to translate the faded script. It spoke of the binding stone, of a heart of memory extracted and sealed. It described the manor as a living prison, sustained by the echoes of what was. The text detailed a counter-ritual, a severance. The angular symbols, he now understood, were not merely decorative. They were a script, a language of containment, of unmaking. The parchment outlined a terrifying process. The stone, once activated, would disrupt the manor's connection to its heart, forcing it to release its hold, but at a terrible cost. The ritual demanded a memory, a specific, potent memory, offered as a counterweight to the manor's consumption, a part of himself, given willingly, to sever the parasitic link. This wasn't merely a way to escape, it was a way to fight back, to wound the entity that had been devouring him. But the cost was personal, intimate. The house reacted. The partitions of the border checkpoint seemed to waver, the air around him growing thick and viscous, pressing against his lungs. The manor knew. It knew he had found its weakness. The glimmer of resistance had become a fragile, burning ember. He understood the stakes now, the terrifying, desperate choice before him. The cold spark of defiance, a fragile ember in the maelstrom of his disintegrating mind, flickered. Marcus felt it, a faint pulse against the encroaching emptiness. He was losing himself. That much was undeniable. But the thought of passive surrender now tasted like ash. He had to do something, even if the action was futile. His goal was vague: retrace his steps, find the journal, seek an exit, or simply understand the precise nature of his torment. He pushed himself from the tattered armchair, the fabric rasping against his clothes. The library, once a sanctuary of knowledge, now felt like a mausoleum. The air, thick with the scent of aged paper and decay, pressed in on him. He took a single step toward the door, a heavy oak panel that had always felt solid. A low groan emanated from the very structure of the manor, a sound that resonated deep in his bones, not merely in his ears. It was the sound of old timber protesting, of stone shifting under an unseen stress. The floorboards beneath his feet vibrated faintly. He paused, his breath catching. This was not the usual creak of an ancient dwelling settling. This was deliberate. He reached for the doorknob. Before his fingers could close around the cool brass, the door slammed shut with a concussive force that rattled the glass in the nearby bookshelves. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through the grime-streaked windows. Marcus staggered back, his heart thudding a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs. He stood frozen, listening. The silence that followed was heavier, more oppressive than any sound. He tried another door, one leading to a narrow servant's passage he had discovered weeks prior. This door, too, resisted. He pushed, pulled, even kicked lightly. It remained unyielding, as if fused to the frame. It felt solid, yet he sensed a subtle alteration, a tightening of the space. The house was not merely reacting, it was actively obstructing. Driven by a desperate need for clarity, Marcus decided to attempt a more direct route. The main staircase, leading to the ground floor and, theoretically, the main entrance. He navigated the labyrinthine corridors, each turn feeling subtly different from his memory. He reached the main hall, a cavernous space usually filled with the ghosts of grandeur. Tonight, it felt like the inside of a closed fist. The grand staircase, an elegant sweep of polished wood and ornate balusters, now appeared distorted. The steps seemed to rise at an unnatural angle, the banister twisting like a gnarled vine. As he placed his foot on the first step, a figure materialized at the top of the landing. It was indistinct, a wavering outline of a woman in a long, flowing gown, her face a featureless blur. He took another step. The spectral figure on the landing seemed to ripple, its form momentarily solidifying into an expression of profound sorrow, then dissolving back into an ethereal haze. A wave of profound sadness washed over Marcus, a grief that was not his own. yet felt utterly consuming. It was a memory, he realized, but one that was being forced upon him, a fragment of another's despair. He stumbled backward, shaking his head to dislodge the intrusive emotion. The house was fighting back, not just with physical impediments, but with a psychological assault designed to dismantle his will. It was not just consuming his memories, it was using the memories of others, weaponizing their anguish. He turned, seeking an alternative path. Perhaps a service stairwell he knew existed behind the kitchen. He pushed through a heavy swinging door, expecting the familiar scent of disused culinary spaces. Instead, he found himself in an entirely different environment. The air here was sharp, metallic, tinged with exhaust fumes and damp concrete. Fluorescent lights, flickering erratically, illuminated a narrow corridor lined with dull, institutional green walls. Ahead, a heavy steel barrier, scarred and rusted, stretched across the passage. A sign above the barrier, painted in peeling, blocky letters, read, "Border checkpoint." Marcus stared, his mind struggling to reconcile this impossible reality. He was still within the manor, yet this was undeniably a border checkpoint, complete with the distant rumble of unseen machinery and the faint, garbled crackle of a radio. It was a tangible, physical manifestation, yet utterly illogical. The slumped figure stirred, slowly lifting its head. Marcus felt a profound, suffocating panic. He was trapped, not just in a house, but in a nightmare constructed from his own anxieties about escape and confinement. The house was not just a place, it was a consciousness that could manifest any reality it desired, drawing on the collective unconscious of its victims. Another spectral form, this one tall and gaunt, emerged from behind the counter. It wore a uniform similar to the slumped figure, but carried a heavy, archaic-looking ledger. It glided towards Marcus, its movements unnervingly smooth. There was no escape. This was the house's ultimate weapon, not just to consume his life, but to utterly obliterate his identity, to deny him passage back to himself, back to reality. The border checkpoint was a final, psychological barrier, erected not to keep him out, but to ensure his permanent absorption. He was not just a prisoner, he was a document to be processed, a memory to be filed away into the house's vast, decaying archives. The full extent of its malevolence, its active, predatory intelligence, crashed over him. It wasn't just waiting for him to wither, it was actively hunting his last vestiges of self. He turned, desperate to flee this impossible space, but the corridor behind him had vanished, replaced by a solid, unyielding wall of damp stone. He was sealed in, cornered by an illusion that felt more real than anything he had known. The gaunt figure advanced, its skeletal fingers stretching, not to touch him, but to pluck at the edges of his vision, making the world waver and blur. Marcus felt his own memories, precious fragments of his past, being tugged, stretched, and distorted, like threads unraveling from a tapestry. His defiance, that fragile spark, threatened to be extinguished entirely. He was not just fighting a house, he was fighting an entity that sought to erase him from existence, piece by agonizing piece. The air at the border checkpoint was thick, a viscous, chilled presence that pressed in on Marcus's chest. It was not a physical wall, nor a gate, but a threshold marked by an invisible line that hummed with a malevolent energy. Before him, the corridor warped, its stone walls seeming to breathe, the ancient tapestry hanging askew on the left rippling without a breeze. This was the place where it sought to strip away the final vestiges of himself. He swallowed, his throat suddenly parched, his hand tightened around the rolled parchment he clutched, the stiff, yellowed paper a fragile anchor in the swirling uncertainty. This was it, the culmination of his desperate research, the forgotten truth he had unearthed in a dusty, crumbling archive, a secret buried deep within the manor's own foundational stones. He had found its name, its true purpose, and he believed its vulnerability. A low groan reverberated through the very floor beneath his worn boots, a sound like ancient timber twisting, or perhaps something far older and more organic groaning in anticipation. He took a hesitant step forward, crossing the invisible line. Immediately, the atmosphere intensified. The air grew heavy, pressing down on him, stealing the breath from his lungs. He recognized fragments, the panicked cry of a child, the weary sigh of an elder, the sharp, angry retort of a long-dead resident. He flinched, but pushed through the instinct to retreat. This was the house's ultimate defense, a psychic maelstrom designed to disorient and consume. He focused on the parchment in his hand, its rough texture grounding him. He remembered the precise etching on the family crest, the obscure sigil in the corner of the ancient map he had found, the journal entry detailing the manor's true dedication. He took another step, then another, his movements slow, deliberate, as if wading through thick mud. The corridor ahead stretched into an impossible distance, the perspective shifting and distorting. What had been a straight passage now seemed to curve inward, the walls leaning closer, threatening to crush him. He could feel his own thoughts beginning to fray, slivers of doubt piercing his resolve. Was this real? Had he truly found a weakness, or was this merely another elaborate deception, a trap laid by the sentient structure? The air shimmered, and a faint, sickly green luminescence pulsed from the gaps between the ancient stones of the walls. He could see now, just ahead, where the corridor seemed to open into a cavernous, unlit chamber, the heart of the house, the nexus of its power. He pushed himself forward, each step a monumental effort. They were the house's victims, their consciousnesses trapped, fragmented echoes yearning for release, or perhaps begging him to join them. It tried to tell him that resistance was futile, that surrender was inevitable, that he was inevitable. Reaching the opening of the chamber, Marcus stopped, bracing himself. The threshold here was marked by an actual archway, crafted from what looked like petrified wood, gnarled and twisted into grotesque shapes. But he knew what lay within. He had pieced together the fragments. With a deep, shuddering breath, he stepped through. He could see nothing, but he could feel it. A colossal, unseen presence that filled the space, a hunger so vast it was almost abstract. It was the house, distilled to its rawest, most concentrated form. He extended his arm, the rolled parchment held aloft. "Marcus, know you," Marcus declared, his voice trembling slightly but firm. "Marcus, know your true name, your genesis." The house was reacting, its malevolence now focused entirely on him, a singular crushing force. He stumbled, nearly falling, but caught himself. He could not falter now. He had come too far. He had lost too much. "You were built," he continued, forcing the words out, "not just as a dwelling, but as a monument to a binding, a sacrifice. You were meant to contain, not to consume. Your foundation is etched with the true purpose." It was a replica of the original deed, detailing the arcane conditions of the manor's construction, a forgotten ritual designed to contain the very essence it now wielded freely. The vast, unseen presence in the chamber recoiled, a sudden, violent surge of cold air sweeping past Marcus, carrying with a faint, guttural shriek that seemed to tear at the fabric of the air itself. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony and rage. The pressure on his mind intensified, a thousand voices screaming at once, trying to drown out his own thoughts, to shatter his concentration. He saw himself, younger, laughing, then older, alone, then an unrecognizable face staring back from a mirror, then no face at all. His nose began to bleed, a worm trickled down his lip, and a sharp, metallic tang filled his mouth. He felt lightheaded, his knees threatening to buckle. The parchment, however, still glowed, its light strengthening slightly, pushing back the absolute blackness that surrounded him. He knew he was standing at the precipice, facing the raw, unfiltered power of the manor. This was the true threshold, not just into a room, but into the very heart of its malevolence. He had initiated the confrontation. Now, he had to see it through or be utterly lost. The house was fighting for its life, and he for his. The searing pressure behind Marcus's eyes intensified, a vise tightening around his skull. The palpable absence of light churned into a vortex, not merely consuming the room, but threatening to pull him apart, molecule by molecule. His hands flew to his temples, pressing hard, futilely attempting to anchor himself. He could hear it now, a chorus of whispers, not distinct words, but a cacophony of lost voices, a symphony of forgotten agonies. He recognized a cadence, a turn of phrase, a particular despair from the journals he'd unearthed. They were his memories now tainted, corrupted, indistinguishable from the house's own vast, hungry archive. This wasn't just an attack. It was an invitation. He was being Anzard. He was Marcus, a historian. He had fought for truth, for clarity, against the seductive fog of myth. He would not surrender his narrative. He clung to it, a mental anchor against the tide. The house recoiled, a barely perceptible shudder in the overwhelming presence. It didn't like resistance. It wanted quiet assimilation. Marcus pushed back. Not with physical force, but with the sheer will of his intellect. He projected an image, a detailed mental blueprint of the house's structure, its foundations, its weaknesses. He knew its history, its patterns of feeding, its moments of vulnerability. He knew the precise location of the hidden crypt, the ancient rituals inscribed on the sarcophagus within. Not magic, but a desperate, archaic form of containment. He flooded his mind with this knowledge, a weaponized memory against its own. He stumbled forward, blinking. He was standing on a grimy, concrete floor. Fluorescent lights, stark and unwavering, cast a sickly yellow glow on a low ceiling. Ahead, a series of metal barriers formed a narrow lane. Beyond the barriers, a vast, empty stretch of asphalt shimmered under the artificial light. He was at a border checkpoint. The air smelled of diesel and antiseptic. A low-frequency thrum resonated through the floor, vibrating up his legs. Marcus took a tentative step, his mind reeling. How had he gotten here? A figure emerged from the booth. Marcus fumbled at his pockets. His heart hammered, a frantic drum against his ribs. He couldn't remember packing a bag, let alone a passport. His hands came up empty. He looked at the guard, trying to articulate the impossible journey, the malevolent house, the absorption, the expulsion. The words caught in his throat, nonsensical on the tip of his tongue. Marcus's mind raced, searching for an explanation, any explanation. He remembered the house. Yes, the struggle, the pain, but the details of his life before, his purpose, his identity beyond the immediate past. They were blurred, distant, like old photographs bleached by the sun. He looked down at his hands. They were pale, trembling slightly. His clothes were rumpled, stained with dust and grime he couldn't recall accumulating. He felt lighter, a significant part of him had been left behind. I don't have one, Marcus managed, his voice raspy. I just came from the manor. The guard's expression remained unchanged. His eyes flickered, just for a moment, to something behind Marcus. Marcus turned, slowly, fearfully. There was nothing there but the concrete wall, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights. He faced the guard again. I need to go back, he said, the words surprising him. A strange, insistent pull, a low thrumming in his bones, urged him to return, not to the horror, but to something he had left. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide and haunted, but beneath the surface, something else was there. He had escaped. Or had he merely been reformed? The hum of the checkpoint was not a machine, he realized with dawning horror. It was the low thrum of a vast, insatiable entity, resonating within his own bones. The border was not a physical line, but a new state of being. Changed. He was no longer merely Marcus. He was a new kind of vessel, carrying within him an echo of its vast, consuming hunger, forever bound to its insidious resonance, a living, breathing fragment of the manor's eternal malevolent will.